Hi there, and welcome to this video on GCSE Biology for the AQA Specification, focusing on transport in cells and in particular diffusion. I'm Shumina from StudyMind, where we help you revise GCSE Biology with our helpful video tutorials, tailored to your subject, your specification, and to you. If you're new here, make sure you click the subscribe button. Whilst you are watching, please leave any comments below if you're unsure about anything, and let us know if it's your first time watching our videos so we can send you our free revision materials. We also have helpful timestamps below for each part of the video to help guide you through the specification. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome to this tutorial on diffusion. So this tutorial will be a part of a series on transport in cells. So we're going to be having a look at the three different forms of transport that you have to consider for your exams. So diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. So we'll be having a look at the basics of diffusion, factors affecting diffusion, surface area to volume ratios, and exchange in large organisms. And these are your specification points for today, so there's quite a few of them, 2 whole pages of them. So just go through them and make sure you familiarise yourself with exactly what the examiners want you to take from these tutorials on diffusion. So first of all, the definition of diffusion is the passive movement of a substance in a solution from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. So there's a few words that you really need to commit to memory here. So first of all, passive. So diffusion is the passive movement, i.e. it doesn't require energy, okay? And that would be energy in the form of ATP. And you will see that there are different types of transport, such as active transport, which are active movements, so they require energy. So diffusion is the passive movement of a substance in a solution from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. So these are the words that are really, really important in this definition. So do make sure that you include those words if you are asked to define what diffusion is. And if I were you, I would just commit this whole sentence to memory, because then you know that you have all the really important points in there. You're going to hit those buzzwords in the mark scheme. So as I said, passive means that it doesn't require energy. And so diffusion occurs in liquids and gases, so not really in solids, and because it requires the movement of a substance in a solution. And so it can occur in the cytoplasm of cells, for example. And this is just a diagrammatic explanation, so just in case you're slightly unsure what I mean by high to low concentration. So if we have a solute, for example, so we've got a higher concentration on this side, so there's more particles on this side of the membrane, there's fewer particles on this side of the membrane. This would be a partially permeable membrane, which means that these molecules can diffuse across to the other side because the membrane has these gaps. That's all I mean by partially permeable. And yeah, so we have our particles moving from a higher to a lower concentration, and that's all diffusion is. So really, really, really simple. And it's passive because it's moving down the concentration gradient, so from high to low. How I like to think of it is we have our high concentration up here, our low concentration down there. We're moving down the concentration gradient, and you will see that we literally refer to it as moving down the concentration gradient. We'll talk about this more on slides to come. Now, let's have a look at some examples of diffusion in the body. So diffusion occurs in the alveoli of the lungs, for example. So alveoli are the simplest structure in the lungs where gas exchange occurs, and you might remember in some tutorials where I've talked about alveoli looking like a bunch of grapes, because that's essentially what they have a high, well, that's not what they are, that's what I was about to say, that's not what they are, but that's what they look like. They have a high surface area to allow for diffusion of gases in and out of the bloodstream, which would be directly alongside the alveoli. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So diffusion occurs in the alveoli. Oxygen diffuses from a high concentration in the alveoli into the blood across the capillaries, whereas carbon dioxide diffuses in the opposite direction, also down at a concentration gradient, because remember we're talking about diffuse, yeah? So it would always be down a concentration gradient. So if you just think about this, you don't really need to commit this to memory because you can think about this really logically. So when we breathe in, the atmosphere has a higher concentration of oxygen compared to the blood that's returning to our lungs, because obviously the blood that's returning to our lungs has passed through all of our major organ systems, all of our muscles. Most of the oxygen has been taken up from the blood. It's going to return back to the lungs, and this blood is going to be extremely low in oxygen. So therefore, there's going to be a high concentration in the alveoli. So if I just draw a single alveoli, an alveolus, that's the singular of alveoli, you have your capillary running alongside. So this is essentially looking at this diagram, but kind of in a more 2D format, or 3D, if you can call it that. So we're going to have a higher O2 concentration. I do that in black. So we're going to have a higher O2 concentration in the alveoli, okay? Because we are breathing air in. I'll just show you the air coming in. Do it in yellow. So we're breathing that in, right? So our high oxygen in the environment is going to go into there. We've got low oxygen returning to the lungs. So therefore, we are going to have oxygen diffusing from the alveoli into the blood across the capillaries. And that's brilliant because that is exactly what we need to happen. We need this oxygen to diffuse across down its concentration gradient. And so the same will happen with carbon dioxide, except we're going to have a very high carbon dioxide concentration in the blood returning to the alveoli. And because we have respiration going on in our muscles, right, and that produces carbon dioxide. So the blood returning to the lungs is going to be extremely high in carbon dioxide. It's going to diffuse down its concentration gradient again into the alveoli where there's a lower carbon dioxide gradient. So therefore we're going to see this movement this way. Okay? So oxygen is diffusing into the blood, carbon dioxide diffusing into the alveoli. Both are always going down their concentration gradient, okay? Anytime we talk about diffusion, it's always down a concentration gradient. So oxygen as well is also diffusing down its concentration gradient because it's a passive movement. Okay, bro. So now let's look at another example. So diffusion in the liver and kidney. So urea is produced by the liver as a waste product of the body. So we need to get rid of it, right? So it's going to diffuse from the liver cells into the blood from an area of higher concentration in the liver cells to an area of lower concentration in the blood. And this is a really effective mechanism of getting rid of this urea. So you can see it's in a high concentration over here, it's in lower concentration over here, and it's going to diffuse down its concentration gradient into the blood. And just one thing I want to point out here is that we say molecules diffuse from an area of high to an area of low concentration. Now, these are very arbitrary terms. We can't really give you a solid statistic that describes what a high or a low concentration is. All that really matters is that at the end of the day, we're moving the molecules down the concentration gradient. So that's why I put the ER on the end of here, because this concentration might still be pretty high, but the point is that it's lower than the high concentration of urea in the liver cells. Okay, so anytime you're confused about this, just make sure we're always going down the concentration gradient, so from high to lower, or higher to low. Understand? Okay. So the urea then goes to the kidneys via the bloodstream to be excreted. So you can see those were some examples of how diffusion may occur in the body. So now, what are the factors that affect diffusion? So we were talking just now on the previous slide that it all depends on our molecules moving down a concentration gradient. Now, when I say down, as I said earlier, I mean from high to low, okay? So from high up here to low, right? Now, can you see how there's two different concentration gradients here? This one is pretty shallow, this one is very steep, so we say there's a greater concentration gradient. And that's because we're moving to the same low concentration. So if let's say our y-axis is, our y-axis is concentration, okay? So if I just try to draw a line there, so this is our y-axis and this is concentration. So we're moving to the same low concentration, aren't we? They're on the same level. But our high concentration in each of these scenarios is at a different level of high, a different level of the word high. So you can see here when it's really high, the concentration gradient is steeper because we're moving through greater differences in concentration. Whereas here it's shallower because from high to low there's less of a distance. Does that make sense? So the greater the concentration gradient, the quicker diffusion takes place. Okay, so that means if I were to ask you which one would have the quicker diffusion rate, it would always be the one with the steeper concentration gradient, so the triangle on the right over here. So, however, if there is an equal concentration in both, the rate of diffusion will be very low because the concentration gradient will be shallower. So if this high concentration gradient here were to be moved down a little bit, the concentrations are almost equalised. So if we were to draw the triangle kind of like this, excuse my wobbly lines, but you get the idea. So the rate of diffusion will be very low because the difference is lower. The concentration gradient is smaller. So that's basically going over what a concentration gradient is. If you're a little bit confused about that, do just go back and watch it again because it's a really simple concept, and once you understand that, the rest of this tutorial will make perfect sense. So factors affecting diffusion include temperature. So as the temperature increases, particles gain more energy and therefore they can diffuse across a membrane more quickly. So we've already seen that diffusion is the movement of particles from a high to a low concentration gradient. They're moving, so the temperature increases, they're buzzing about even faster, like this, okay? And therefore they're going to diffuse faster across the membrane. Whereas if they're at a lower temperature, they're going to be moving more slowly because they've got less kinetic energy. So the whole diffusion process, the whole movement, will take much longer. Okay? Now, surface area. So as the surface area of a membrane increases, the rate of diffusion also increases. Now, this is because there is more space for molecules to diffuse across the membrane. So you can see here, the circumference of this we'll call it a circle for the sake of it, but imagine it being something in the body that substances are diffusing across. So this circumference is going to be, so the distance around this circle is going to be lower than the distance around this circle, right? Which means that fewer molecules at a time can get right on the membrane to diffuse across. Whereas here, more molecules can fit, right? We've already got more going around half of this circle than around all of this circle. So, all of this circle. So, that means that more molecules can fit across this surface area, therefore more can diffuse at any one point. Whereas here, we're going to need longer for all of the molecules to diffuse across because only a few can fit around at the same time. So therefore we need a larger surface area if we want to increase our rate of diffusion. Now, simple organisms do not have a specific transport. They instead can meet their demands of substances through diffusion. Okay, so we don't, for example, eat by diffusion, do we? But single-celled organisms get their nutrients through diffusion. So substances pass through a partially permeable membrane into their inside from a high to a low concentration gradient. So these single-celled organisms are able to do this as they have a very large surface area to volume ratio, okay, because they're small. Now I know that doesn't make sense because if you think back to the last slide, we had a small circle and I said that has a smaller surface area, and then we had a large circle and I said that has a larger surface area, and now I'm saying that this smaller circle has a larger surface area to volume ratio. Well, that's because the volume of this is smaller than the volume of this, okay? So the ratio is larger in this circle. So that's a little bit complicated, so I'm going to go through to the next slide and talk you through it in more mathsy terms, which might make more sense. So you might be asked to calculate the surface area to volume ratio. So if an organism has a surface area of 4 meters squared and a volume of 2 meters cubed, you might be asked to calculate the surface area to volume ratio. So what I'd like to do is write it out really logically. So we have our surface area. We're writing it as a ratio, so we put these two little dots in to volume, okay? So it's so simple if you just do it the way I'm about to show you. So we can see that the surface area is 4 meters squared. So I'm going to write 4 underneath here. I'm going to ditch the units, okay, because ratios do not have units. So in other circumstances, so in other kind of calculations that you do, I would always say write the units so you remember they're there and you remember to put them in your final answer. But not in ratios, because ratios are comparative. They don't require units. So again, so for the volume, I'm going to write the number 2, and I'm going to ditch the meters cubed because it's a ratio. So this is our kind of raw ratio. It's not simplified into the kind of format that we need to present in the exam. So we have a 4:2 surface area to volume ratio. Now, in order to make it a proper ratio, we're going to have to get this volume number down to 1. So what I then do is I write this, I write the number 1 in, and then I think, well, what am I doing to get from here to here? I'm just dividing by 2, right? So you've got to do exactly what you do on this side of the equation, on this side, okay? Or on this side of the ratio, you've got to do exactly the same to this side. So if you're dividing the volume number by 2, you're going to have to also divide the surface area by 2. And that's going to give us 2. So the surface area to volume ratio is 2:1, or 2. You could present it as either of those values. Okay, so that was really simple, wasn't it? So that's how I would suggest you work out these ratios. So by doing it in that step-to-step process, just remember you have to get this number on the right down to 1, because that's the standard way we present ratios. So anything you do on this side to get 1, you've got to copy on this side, okay? So the surface area to volume ratio is 2. Now, let's compare smaller and larger organisms. So this is now having a look at what surface area to volume ratio actually means. So single-celled organisms, as I said earlier, have a very large surface area to volume ratio. However, larger organisms have a greater volume with a smaller increase in surface area. Therefore, actually, they have a lower surface area to volume ratio, and this means that the rate of diffusion would be too slow in large organisms to provide all the transport. And therefore, these organisms require a transport system, which is why we have so many transport systems. So just remember that a larger organism has a lower surface area to volume ratio. Smaller organisms have larger surface area to volume ratios, okay? I found that really tricky to wrap my head around back when I was doing my GCSEs, but once it clicks, it's really nice. It's just simply because in larger organisms, the volume number is too high, and therefore that pushes the ratio down because we're dividing by a bigger number, remember? Okie dokie. So, now let's have a look at exchange in large organisms. So, the small intestine contains villi, and these villi have microvilli, so I'm sure you've seen in previous tutorials and also in your general science lessons, the villi kind of look like this. And they are on the inside, kind of lining the small intestine, so they'd be on this side of the wall rather than this side of the wall. And the villi, if you zoom in on them, so if I take a chunk here and I zoom in on that little chunk there is going to have multiple little squiggles, and those are our microvilli, okay? Now, what's the purpose of this? What's this all about? Why do we not just have a nice smooth wall, kind of like this? Why do we have something that resembles this? It seems a bit funky, doesn't it? Well, it's all because we want to make our exchange more efficient. So the villi have microvilli. This increases the surface area for transport because, remember, more molecules can now fit on the surface of the small intestine and therefore allow for more efficient absorption. So also the small intestine has a very rich blood supply, which increases the rate of diffusion, and that's because if you have more blood kind of gushing past the wall, the concentration gradient is going to be maintained, and therefore that increases the rate of diffusion because it keeps a steep concentration gradient. The small intestine also has a short diffusion path by the walls being very, very thin. Now the lungs have alveoli, and this, as I said earlier, it increases the surface area for diffusion. And similar to the small intestine, the alveoli also have a rich blood supply, therefore keeping the concentration gradient going and therefore increasing the rate of diffusion. Now looking at fish, so the gills are a part of the fish that act as an exchange surface between blood and the water. So almost kind of equivalent to our lungs, but different in structure. So fish have an operculum, which is a flap that keeps the water flowing over the gills. Oops, didn't mean to draw on that. And this maintains the concentration gradient. So also within the fish, blood keeps flowing, thus maintaining the concentration gradient on the inside. So we have kind of two things maintaining the concentration gradient in fish. We have the water flowing over the gills, and we also have the blood that's flowing within the fish, and this maintains the concentration gradient on both sides and therefore allows for a really high rate of diffusion. Now in plants have roots which are very long, which increases their surface area, and also roots might have root hairs, which further increases the surface area, because if we have a long root like this, and then that root has root hairs, that's going to increase the surface area even more, isn't it? And just remind you of the structure of a plant leaf. So we also have stomata, which maintain the concentration gradient and allow gases to move into and out of the leaves because they control the gaps in the leaf surface. And as well as that, the leaves of plants are very flat, which increases their surface area. So you can see how organisms are adapted. So I'll just point out the stomata to you. That's where gases diffuse in, and then the spongy mesophyll layer is where gas exchange occurs. That's in one of the tutorials later on. But yes, so you can see the way in which organisms are adapted for gas exchange. So it's really important that you learn all these adaptations because your examiners might ask you about specific ones. So, features of transport that we have already covered, and I'm just going to summarise here. So there must be a large surface area. There must be a thin membrane to reduce the length of the diffusion pathway. There must be an efficient blood supply in animals to maintain the concentration gradient. And ventilation must be constant in animals for gaseous exchange. Now we've seen all of this in the examples on the last few slides, so go back and perhaps annotate these kind of generalised statements with examples. So they must have a large surface area. You can talk about the alveoli in the lungs, or you can talk about the microvilli and villi in the small intestine. Okay? So you can see how these are kind of generalised statements to allow for efficient transport, but you also have specific examples that we've gone through in this tutorial that will really help to make your answer wonderful. Now that's all for today. This was a really chunky tutorial, so do go back and watch it, but I think that if you understand what diffusion is, it will make learning osmosis and active transport even easier, so do make sure that you get a good grip of this. Now well done for today, and I'll see you for the next session. Thanks for watching this free video from StudyMind. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe to catch our newest videos by clicking below, and leave a comment on a topic you'd like a video on. Click here to watch more videos in our series for GCSE Biology, or visit our website studymind.co.uk for free past paper compilations by topic and specification.